Today in Avatar, we get a ridiculous Golgari combo piece, Gift Ungiven but for lands, a Red Ascension, Rampant Growth back at standard, and so much more, so let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Live, and it's time for another daily dose of Avatar spoilers. So we've reached week 2 of spoiler season. We should get the full set by the end of this week, but today we got a bunch of really interesting cards to talk about, so we better jump right into it, start talking spicy new Avatar cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Avatar. First up today, we get a new rare red enchantment in Firebender Ascension. And Firebender Ascension seems pretty good. It's a 2-mana red enchantment. It says when it enters, create a 2/2 red soldier creature token with Firebending 1, and then when a creature you control attacking causes a triggered ability of that creature to trigger, put a quest counter on the enchantment, and then if it has 4 more quest counters on it, you can copy the ability and choose a new target for the copy. So obviously the token that you make with Firebending lets you get started on attacking because Firebending is a triggered ability that'll trigger when you attack, so that token's going to help power this up. And then once it's fully powered up, you essentially have like an Ishin, essentially a Panharmonicon for your attack triggers that you only pay 2 mana for. So Firebender Ascension, it seems like it's probably part of a cycle or a semi-cycle. We already saw Airbender Ascension. I would guess we get Earthbender Ascension and Waterbender Ascension too. We'll have to wait and see. Maybe we get a Bloodbender Ascension. I don't know. Maybe we get even more Ascensions. But both of these seem pretty powerful because you're paying such a low mana cost for what you end up getting once the card is fully powered up. So Firebender Ascension, it's essentially Fire Sages, a 2-mana 2/2 with Firebending 1. I guess you don't get the mana sync part of it, but that's fine. So you're essentially getting a Fire Sages that eventually upgrades into a Windcrag Siege, an Ishin effect, that Panharmonicon for your attack triggers. So this card, it seems designed to go with other firebending cards, right? Because firebending is a triggered ability that triggers when you attack. So anytime you attack with a firebender, you're going to get a counter on Firebender Ascension. And once you do that 4 times, then all these cards become ridiculous because you're going to double trigger them. So you attack with an Ozai and you end up getting Firebending 8 extra mana that you can cast during combat, or Sozin's Comet. Everything gets Firebending 5. You're just going to make a ridiculous amount of mana. So Firebender Ascension, it actually seems really, really strong in a firebending deck. And the thing I love about this card is, unlike a lot of Panharmonicons, it actually adds to the board, and I think that's what makes this card good. If this was just the enchantment and you didn't get the token, I'd be kind of meh on the card. It would still be fun, but I don't think it would be nearly as powerful. But the fact that you get a relatively on-curve creature, a 2-mana 2/2 with Firebending 1, and then eventually you end up with this free Ishin effect, I think it's going to make this card very powerful. So it seems great in Firebending. It also seems good with other attack triggers once you get it powered up. So Mobilize, for example, is kind of a lot like Firebending. Whenever one of your mobilized creatures attack, you're going to make some tokens. It's a triggered ability during combat. Once you get it powered up, you get double the tokens. Or Overlord of the Boiler Biggle deals 4 damage when it attacks. Anna makes a bunch of tokens. Mardu Siegebreaker copies the things it exiles. So there's a bunch of different ways you can build around this card. And as I mentioned before, just because this card is so much more playable on its own than just a standalone enchantment because of that creature, I actually think it's going to be worth putting in a lot of these decks. So I'm excited to try like Mobilize with this card and just brewing around these random attack triggers with the card. Once you get back to Commander, we already have a couple of commanders that do this, right? Ishin doubles your attack triggers, Wolfgar doubles your attack triggers. So Firebender Ascension isn't really reinventing the wheel. We have similar cards that do this, but if you're a deck that would be playing any of the Ishin effects, these double your combat trigger effects, which like Arabella or Caesar or Winota or Anna, you just play Firebender Ascension 2, I think. I think it's just going to be really good in any of those decks. But the unique point of Firebender Ascension is we've never had an Attack-A-Monicon, an Ishin effect that's in mono red. So being in mono red opens up this effect for a bunch more commanders. They couldn't play it before. And mono red has some really good attack trigger commanders, like Atali, for example. One of the strongest attack triggers in the game, right? You just exile the top cards of everyone's deck. You get to play them for free. Double triggering Atali every time it attacks is going to win games really quick. Or Kranko Tin Street Kingpin, going to make goblins when it attacks. Dracu Seth damage when it attacks. Layla Impulse draws when it attacks. Delina arena, gonna let you roll dice and copy things when it attacks. And these are all decks that just didn't have access to this effect before because of the color identity rule. And I think that Firebender Ascension is gonna be a staple in all those decks. The other place it's gonna be really absurd if you build around it a little bit is with extra combat commanders. Imagine playing like Karlash or Morag, these commanders that can let you attack a bunch of times in a turn, and then building around attack triggers. It's going to get out of control really, really quickly. Like, mono red firebending with Morag as your commander is going to do some ridiculous things. So I think that Firebender Ascension, it's exciting for 3 reasons. One is it gives you a token, which makes the card way more playable. 2 is it's just really efficient. At 2 mana, it's the cheapest attack Monicon we've seen so far. And then the third one is it's mono red, which just lets you play it in more decks. So I think Firebender Ascension, I'm excited to build around it in Standard. It seems really fun and like it could be pretty powerful, and it has a bunch of spicy commander homes. We also got a new lesson in Elemental Teaching. So Elemental Teachings, 5 mana green instant lesson. It says search your library for up to 4 land cards with different names and reveal them. An opponent chooses 2 of those cards. Put the chosen cards in your graveyard, the rest onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. So Elemental Teachings, it's essentially Gifts Ungiven for lands, which I guess means it's actually Realms Uncharted, but it's Realms Uncharted that puts the lands that you get into the battlefield, which kind of makes it like a weird Hour of Promise. Essentially, for 5 mana, you're going to end up ramping 2 lands into play, and you can ramp non-basic lands, which is nice. That's the Hour of Promise part of the card. The downside is you got to pick 4 lands, and your opponent's going to give you, theoretically, the worst 2 of those 4 lands. So is Elemental Teachings any good? And I'm kind of skeptical of this card in all honesty, and it might be because of Realms Uncharted. So Gifts Ungiven is like an infamously broken card, and then after they printed Gifts Ungiven, like 10 years later or something, they printed Realms Uncharted, and I remember when they first previewed Realms Uncharted, people went crazy because it looked like Gifts Ungiven, and it was a really expensive card during pre-sales, and then the card ended up being absolutely stone unplayable. So maybe that's part of the reason why I'm not super hyped about Elemental Teachings. I do think it's interesting that it's at instant speed, but if you think about Standard, I'm not sure this card is actually that good for 2 reasons. So one is we get a bunch of other cards that can ramp 2 lands into play, like Map the Frontier, Encroaching Dragonstorm. And yes, it's nice that Elemental Teachings can get non-basics. And yes, it's pretty interesting that it's instant speed, can be relevant with landfall shenanigans and stuff. But in Standard, we also just don't have that great of lands to get with this. What are you getting? Like a Maze's End, a Fountain Port, and a Vando, a Delvokian enchantment. So I feel like the lands that you can get with this, I don't see any combos. It's not like if you get these specific lands, you pull super far ahead. So I'm not convinced this is like meaningfully better than something like Map the Frontier or Encroaching Dragonstorm in Standard. And those cards already are like random cards we brew around on against the odds and not Standard staples. So I'm a little bit skeptical it's going to be actually a good Standard card. It is really sweet with Head Shredder. I think this is the best synergy for the card in Standard. Head Shredder, if 1 or more lands would be put into your graveyard from your library, you put them onto the battlefield tap. So with Elemental's Teachings, Head Shredder becomes insane because you can cast Elemental Teachings, you tutor up 4 lands, and essentially you just get all 4 of those lands because 2 go into play because of Elemental Teachings, the other 2 go to the graveyard, those will be going to the graveyard from the library, and then you just get to put them into play anyway. So I could definitely see trying to build some sort of Head Shredder Elemental Teachings deck. That is actually pretty exciting synergy. There's also some lands that work pretty well with this. One of the tricks of Gifts Ungiven is to break Gifts Ungiven by tutoring up things that let you get the things that your opponent puts into the graveyard back to your hand. So for example, if you really need a Swords to Plowshares, you can get like Swords to Plowshares, Eternal Witness, Snapcaster Mage, and no matter how your opponent piles things, you either get the swords in hand or you're going to get the Snapcaster or the Eternal Witness in hand that can then get back the Swords to Plowshares, and you get what you want anyway. And there's some lands that can kind of do this, like Echoing Deeps. When it enters as a tap copy of any land in your graveyard, but it's a cave as a bonus, or Petrified Field. You can sacrifice it to return a land card from your graveyard to your hand. So if you get these lands in your Elemental Teachings pile, you kind of get a lot of control over what lands you find. Like if you get a Wasteland, a Strip Mine, an Echoing Deeps, and a Petrified Field, it doesn't really matter what your opponent's going to do. You're going to end up getting those Wastelands and Strip Mines eventually anyway. So maybe there's some sort of combo that you can pull off with these cards. The most obvious combo I could find is something like Dark Depths and Thespian Sage, maybe Shifting Woodlands, or if we go back to the Petrified Field, you could also put that there, Echoing Deeps, and basically try to make it so no matter what your opponent does, Promise. You end up with Dark Depths Thespian stage combo, and then make the Merit Lage. The problem I see with that plan is you could just do it with Hour of Promise now and like cut out all the weird middleman stuff and just be like, I cast Hour of Promise and get Thespian Stage and Dark Depths. I guess you get the upside of Elemental Teachings being an instant, so you can do it on your opponent's end step. But I think if 5 mana Tutor Up Dark Depths combo was good enough for like Legacy, we'd already be doing it with Hour of Promise. So I'm not sure that really changes anything. As far as Commander is concerned, this card sort of interests me in Commander. So I am someone who really believes in ramping with non-basic lands, and this is a card that can ramp 2 non-basic lands into play. So I could imagine playing this and just getting like 4 Surveil lands in a 5-color deck and being like, all right, I'm going to get 2 Surveil lands out of the deal. Doing an instant speed is pretty sweet. I think it's going to be at its best in some sort of landfall deck. I think being able to double trigger your Necrobloom or Omnath or Obone at instant speed actually is a pretty powerful effect. So I think that's where I'd be looking for this card. So Elemental Teachings, I don't know. I know people seem very hyped about this card. I actually think it's kind of mid. The most interesting part of it for me is just that it's a ramp spell at instant speed, and we don't get that many instant speed ramp spells, and doubly so for instant speed ramp spells that get non-basic lands. But I haven't really figured out how to break this effect yet, or what makes it meaningfully different than an Hour of Promise. And with Hour of Promise, at least I know I'm getting the 2 lands I want. With this, I either gotta like really build around it or trust my opponent to give me those lands. So let me know what you think of this one. Maybe I'm underestimating this card, but I actually think it's one of those cards that like Realms Uncharted. People are gonna be really hyped about it first, and then they're gonna play with it and be like, I could just cast an Hour of Promise or a Rampant Growth. Next up, we get an interesting new mono black Hate Bear in Mia Scornful Striker. So it's a 2-mana 2/2 legendary human noble ally. It is first strike, and it says whenever a player, so this includes you and your opponents, casts a non-creature spell, they lose 2 life. So Mia, this card's interesting. It's essentially a chem ball that you don't get to gain life off of, but costs 1 less mana. And if you're playing a competitive format like Modern or Legacy, a lot of times costing 1 less mana is going to make up for the fact that you're not gaining a life or that it's symmetrical rather than only hitting your opponents. If you want other comparisons, Magebane Lizard is kind of similar, except the damage increases based on the number of spells. Mia is just always going to be 2 damage. Magebane, we've seen it be very good in Standard in the red decks to fight against the Soul Cauldron decks and the Prowess style decks, but it's 1 damage, then 2 damage, then 3 damage, depending on how many spells are cast. So that's another comparison. I've seen a lot of people call this mono black Thalia, and I just do not see it. Like, I get the comparison is first strike 2-drop with kind of a hateful effect for non-creature spells. So I guess I can see what people are going for, but there is a huge difference between you play your Maya on turn 2 and your opponent's like, okay, untap, play my Arcane Signet, take 2, and you play a Thalia on turn 2 and your opponent's, okay, untap, draw past the turn because I can't actually play my Arcane Signet because I'm getting taxed. So they do different things. This doesn't mean that Mia's bad. I just don't see it serving a similar purpose to Thalia. And I've seen a lot of people say it's mono black Thalia. So Mia, I think this card actually has potential to be pretty good. First off, in Standard, the first strike is a nice bonus. It's not going to make or break the card, but being able to have first strike means that this can kill a Tishana's Tidebinder or an Emberheart Challenger if it hasn't been pumped, or a Flood Pit Drowner, or a Paw Patch Recruiter in combat. It essentially allows it to trade up with a lot of stuff. So I think that just being a 2/2 first striker is a nice little bonus in Standard. The downside of this card in Standard is I'm not sure we have any decks that really care about its ability. When I think of Mia's ability and Kemble's ability, I'm thinking, okay, my opponent's storming off, their spell slingering off. Maybe we end up in a world where Prowess is really popular, and then this could be a good option there. We have seen Magebane Lizard see play to try to shut down the Agatha Soul Cauldron VV deck. I'm working under the assumption that by the time this card releases, we're going to have VV and Soul Cauldron, or at least one of them banned, and that deck's not going to be an issue anymore. If somehow that doesn't happen, not that anyone would be playing Standard anyway, but if that didn't happen and people still played Standard for some reason, then Mia would probably be pretty good, like Magebane Lizard, right? Just to hate on the Cauldron deck. But if you think about decks that might exist once this comes out in Standard, I guess it's good against Simulacrum Synthesizer. You can't just pop off and play a ton of artifacts because you're going to have to take 2 for each. It's good against control decks if you can make it stick. The downside against control is your opponent can just kill it and take 2 and then it's gone. But if it sticks on the battlefield, it is going to be painful for your opponent to just keep casting counter spells and keep casting card draw spells, because everything they cast is going to deal 2 damage. Another consideration is this card is symmetrical, so if you're casting a ton of 9 creature spells, you might want to think twice about playing this, because you could burn yourself out of the game. I think once you get back to older formats, Pioneer and Modern and Legacy, that's where Mia becomes very appealing to me. Like, we have seen Kemble in the past be a legit hate card that saw sideboard play in formats back to Modern and Legacy, and Mia does a very similar thing for 1 less mana and with 1 less color. So if you're playing Pioneer, you're worried about like Arclight Phoenix, it has to cast 3 non-creature spells to come back from the graveyard, or Corey Steelcutter, or Lotus Field combo, Rouse Storm in Modern. Mia's going to be a really good hate piece. Obviously, like any hate piece, it's got to stick on the battlefield, so Mia doesn't stop your opponent from Into the Flood Mawing and then popping off, or Lightning Bolting your Mia and then popping off. But it is a really, really powerful piece against these decks, because it essentially says, even if you're at 20 life, you can only cast 10 non-creature spells before you die. And if your opponent's at a lower life total, it might be 5 or 3 non-creature spells before you die. So it really pressures decks that want to cast a ton of spells in the same turn. Another comparison that I do kind of like is Eidolon of the Great Rebel. And we've seen Eidolon be just a great burn card, a burn staple almost across formats. Eidolon says, when a player casts a spell with converted mana cost 3 or less, it deals 2 damage. It does hit on more things than Maya, which might make Maya more of a sideboard card than Eidolon, which is definitely a main deck card, because pretty much every deck is going to have things mana value 3 or less. Some decks, though, if you're super creature heavy, like a Collected Company deck, might not have that many non-creature spells, so Eidolon does hit on more, but in the right matchup, Maya does something very similar, and it actually has a better body. The other upside of this is you can actually build around Maya more. Like Eidolon, you can't really be like, all right, I just won't play anything that costs 3 or less mana. You're just not going to have a functional deck. But you could build a Maya deck that was pretty much all creatures and had very few non-creature spells, so you wouldn't really damage yourself at all. One of the places I'm excited to try this is in our Mono Black Burn deck. We've played Mono Black Burn in Modern a couple of times now, and I feel like Maya might be good enough as an addition. Like, we're playing Sleeper Agent, right? Like, if we're playing Sleeper Agent, I gotta imagine that Maya would be good enough. But in some ways, this does remind me, it's the closest thing we've seen to Mono Black Eidolon of the Great Revel. And as I was saying before, Eidolon of the Great Revel is like a staple level card. As far as Commander is concerned, I think this card serves 2 purposes. So one is, and I don't want to say too much because I don't play that much CDH really, but I imagine if you're playing CDH or higher powered Commander, this card goes way up in value. Because when I think of high powered Commander or CDH, I think of, Mox Opal, Mox Diamond, Mana Vault, chain together a bunch of things, you drop your hand on turn 1, Dark Ritual ad nauseum kind of combo kills, Storm combo kills. And if you can be like in one of the first seats and just turn 1 drop a Mia, then for the rest of the game, all of your opponents are going to have to take 2 damage every time they play one of their mana rocks, every time they play a cantrip, every time they play any non-creature spell. So it seems very good in high-powered games that are just often built around chaining together these cheap spells and cheap fast mana spells. In casual, I think it's going to be most interesting in decks that care about your opponent losing life every turn. So, Velgavoth, Harrower of Souls, Lisa, Shroud of Dusk, Yasholda, Knight's Blessing. These are decks that just really want your opponent to be losing life repeatedly. And in a deck like that, this is a card that just sits on the battlefield and your opponent plays a mana rock and then they have to take 2 damage and it triggers your Velgavoth. Or your opponent casts a couple of non-creature spells and all of a sudden they lost enough life that you trigger your Stola. Or like Lisa just cares about everyone losing life. You just want to kind of drain the table and do shenanigans with that. And the Maya's great there as well. Like, you're causing your opponents to lose life. You might even lose some life around the way. So Maya, I think this card is interesting for Standard, potentially a good sideboard hate piece in formats like Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy. And in Commander, it seems better the higher powered you're playing, or if you're just playing a deck that really cares about your opponents losing life in every way possible. So I think it has potential to see play across formats. It might be more of a sideboard card than a main deck card, but still a very good one. We also got Beifong's Bounty Hunters in this card. When I first read it, I was like, but then the more I thought about it, I was like, okay, this card might actually be a broken combo piece. So it's a 4-mana 4/4 Golgari Human Mercenary. It says, when a non-land creature you control dies, Earthbend X, where X is that creature's power. So a non-land creature dies, you get to turn a land into a creature with that creature's power. So why would this be exciting? So on level 1, this is just a way to protect your board. We've seen cards in the past that are like, when a non-token creature creature dies, make a token, right? Suckunar Deathkeeper, Sifter of Skulls, there's a bunch of these cards out there. So at the most basic level, the bounty hunters are the same way. You play this, your opponent, I don't know, shoot the sheriffs, your random creature, you get a land creature to replace it. It also triggers based on itself. It doesn't say other creature, which kind of makes it, worst case, a 4-mana 4/4 that when it dies makes another 4/4, kind of like an Old Growth Troll or a Workshop War Chief. These threats that leave behind a big token when they die. It's a little different because rather than a token, you're turning a land into a creature, but a lot of times the effect is going to be roughly the same. So the dream is, you're playing, I don't know, Golgari mid-range in Standard, and you got the Bounty Hunters, and you got a Mosswood Dread Knight, and you got a Preacher of the Schism, and then your opponent casts a Day of Judgment and blows up all your stuff, and you're like, you know what, I'll just turn this land into a 10/10 and smack your face for a ton of damage. Or even if your opponent just shoots the Sheriff and kills your Preacher of the Schism, you're like, all right, I'll Earthbend 2 and I'll make it 2/2. Or even if they kill the Bounty Hunters, at least you get a 4/4 out of it. So its base level is good removal protection, good sweeper protection in any deck that can play it. But what makes this card really exciting is it's actually an absurd combo piece. Like, the wording on this card is actually very, very scary, and the fact that it's 4 mana might make it okay, just be enough mana that it's not going to be too busted, but this card has a lot of synergy. So first, for a very little combo, seems good in like Sephiroth style decks, right? Let's say you have a Sephiroth going, so you get a Blood Artist effect whenever a creature dies. You have a sack out like Umbral Collar Zealot. And let's say you have Infestation Sage, just a 1/1, then when it dies, you make a 1/1. So what you can do is sack the Infestation Stage to the Umbral Collar Zealot. That's going to trigger the Bounty Hunters to let you Earthbend a land into a creature, and you get a Sephiroth trigger. And then you can sack the Earthbend creature to get a Sephiroth trigger. Your land, it's going to die, but then it comes back into play because that's how Earthbend works. And then you have the token from Infestation Sage, so you can sack the token to get a Sephiroth trigger. That's going to trigger the Bounty Hunters because for some reason it doesn't say non-token, it just says non-land. So that's going to trigger the Bounty Hunters, so you can Earthbend another land, and then you can sack that land. So essentially, it's going to double up all your Sephiroth triggers. All your Blood Artist triggers are doubled with this on the battlefield. It gets even crazier, though, once you start throwing some landfall shenanigans into the mix. Like, it's actually very easy to go infinite with this card. So let's say you're doing the same thing, Umbral Collar Zealot Sephiroth shenanigans, but you have a Felidar Retreat out. So whenever a land enters, you can make a 2/2 Cat Beast token. So you can go back to doing the same loop, or you could even replace Sephiroth with something like Iridescent Vine Lasher, since we're doing landfall shenanigans. But you do the same thing, right? You Umbral Collar Zealot, sack a random creature. When that creature dies, you're going to be able to Earthbend a land to turn it into a creature with the same power, and then you can sacrifice the land. When the land dies, it's going to come back into play because of Earthbend's ability, which will then trigger your Felidar Retreat to make a token, and then you can sack that token to start the loop over again. You sack the token, Bounty Hunter is going to Earthbend a land and make a 2/2, then you can sack the land's going to come back into play, trigger your landfall. So essentially, Bounty Hunters, a sacrifice outlet, and a landfall ability that makes a token, a creature token, just gives you infinite sack fodder, and then you win the game with the Sephiroth or whatever. It also gives you infinite landfall triggers, which can do some wild things. It also goes infinite with Bloodghast. Bloodghast, when a land enters, you can return it from the graveyard to your battlefield. So you can Umbral Collar Zealot, sack the Bloodghast, get your Sephiroth trigger, get your Earthbend token, get your Earthbend land for Bounty Hunters, then you sack the Earthbend land, it comes back into play. That's going to return the Bloodghast back into play, so you can start the loop over again. So infinite death triggers, infinite draining with Blood Artist. Once you get back into Commander, there's just so many ways to pull off this loop. It seems at its best in Necrobloom, because Necrobloom gives you a commander that does the landfall make a token thing, which cuts one of the combo pieces out of the loop. But same idea, you make the token, you sack it to a sack outlet, you get the Earthbend land, then you sack the land comes back into play, triggers your landfall stuff, throw in a Blood Artist effect, you win the game. But it works with any landfall trigger, and that's what makes this really fun. If you're playing a landfall deck, the infinite loop, replace the Blood Artist that just wins the game with something like Tiefalakar, and you get an infinitely big creature, or Nisari Surging Animist, and you make infinite mana, or Corsair Crewfix, and you gain infinite life, or Bristly Bill, and you make infinitely big creatures. And you can do this with anything that has landfall make a token. So Scoot Swarm, Spring Art Nantucket, Rampaging Bayloss, there are a bunch more lesser ones I didn't even bother mentioning. So Beifong's Bounty Hunters, the card's actually kind of wild. Like, At first glance, it just looks like a little bit of removal protection, but when you start to think of its specific wording and the fact that it works with token creatures and how landfall can be abused with Earthbend, and you go through all the loops that it can do, I actually think this card's going to be way more exciting than people think. We'll definitely play it in standard as like an against the odds card. I don't know if it'll really be like a competitive standard card at 4 mana, but worst case in commander decks with landfall synergies and sacrifice synergies like Necrobloom, this card is going to be one of the craziest payoffs in your deck. As far as lower rarity cards, got a couple I wanted to shout out today, starting with Shared Roots, which is a card I'm actually surprised exists in standard. It's a 2-mana sorcery lesson. It says search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. So that is right. This is a Rampant Growth, just a straight up Rampant Growth. And I know we've had versions of Rampant Growth, like if you have a dinosaur, you Rampant Growth, or Glimpse the Core, kind of a Rampant Growth, but only for a basic forest in specific. But it has been since Core Set 2012, I believe, that we've actually just had literal Rampant Growth in standard. And we've talked before about the ebb and flow of power level in Magic. And after like Core Set 2012, in the early 2010s, Wizards actually decided that they felt that Rampant Growth was actually just too powerful for standard. So they took 2-mana ramp out of standard, and now a decade later, we see it coming back, and not only back, but technically strictly better. I know people throw around strictly better a lot, and I think this is one of the cases where technically it is correct, but in like 99% of situations, it's not going to matter. But technically being a lesson, I think makes it strictly better than Rampant Growth, because you could have something that cares about a lesson. But I think Shared Root being in standard, actually pretty exciting. We'll see if it's even good enough anymore. Glimpse the Core hasn't been breaking anything, but green has been so bad in standard lately that I feel like getting a little extra boost of power and a real Rampant Growth that can go in a multicolor deck, unlike Glimpse the Core, might actually be a positive thing for the format. We also got Toils of War, an interesting 2-mana enchantment that when it enters, you make a clue token. It's in Orzhov, by the way. And then when you sack a permanent during your turn, create a 1/1 white ally creature token only once each turn. So Toils of War. This card is interesting. In standard, it works pretty well in a sacrifice style deck. The clue is kind of a bonus, but if you're playing like a Sephiroth deck, so much Sephiroth stuff today, you like sack something to Umbral Collar Zealot, you get an ally, you can then sack that to get another trigger off your Sephiroth. So in some sort of sacrifice deck, it seems fine. It is kind of a bummer it's limited to once per turn. It's not going to be like a full combo payoff. It also seems good with like weapons manufacturing. It makes an artifact, a Legion Intruder to sack the artifacts. So it seems nice there as well as just another bonus payoff piece, getting some bodies on the battlefield as you're doing your loops and payoffs. And then once you get back to older formats, really good with fetch lands. If you can just crack a fetch every turn, you get a free 1/1 for cracking your fetch. Not that this is going to be a modern staple, but still free 1/1, not a bad deal for cracking a fetch land. So Toils of War, the once per turn restriction probably keeps it from being too busted, but I do think it actually is a pretty sweet card. We also got Enter the Avatar State, a 1-mana instant lesson in white. This says, until end of turn, target creature you control becomes an avatar in addition to its other types, and it gains flying, first strike, lifelink, and hexproof. And this is just like one of the most aggressive protection spells we've seen. It just kind of does a little bit of everything. So it does like a Lorn Escape, right? Where for 1 mana, you're protecting a creature by giving it hexproof. I guess you don't get indestructible out of it, but close enough in most situations. But also can gain you life if you need to. It lets you block a flyer if you need to. Basically, it is so good on offense and defense. On offense, you can use this to like send your creature to the air and get in some damage and close out the game. And on defense, if you're about to die, you can like send your creature to the air, give it lifelink to gain back some life, and maybe get out of the danger zone. So it's just another 1-mana protection spell, but Enter the Avatar State actually seems like one of the better 1-mana protection spells we've gotten in a while. We also got Bitter Work. Bitter Work, 3-mana Gruul enchantment, says whenever you attack a player with 1 or more creatures with power 4 or greater, you draw a card, and then it has Exhaust 4, Earthbend 4, only during your turn. So you can turn a land into a 4/4 creature with 4 counters on it only once because of Exhaust. So Bitter Work. This card intrigues me mostly for Commander. We see cards like Garruk's Uprising, which draw based on creatures with power 4 or greater entering, or it entering when you have a creature with power 4 or greater, be pretty heavily played in a lot of green decks. And Gruul is very much like green. We have a lot of big creatures to trigger stuff like that. But the upside of Bitter Work is the way it's worded. It says whenever you attack a player with 1 or more creatures with power 4 or greater, it's actually kind of worded like a Timna. So if you have 3 creatures with power 4 or greater, and you're playing commander, you can send 1 to each opponent, and you end up drawing 3 cards off this each turn cycle. So better work, it's not like busted or anything, but then you get the upside too that you do the boomy thing and like turn a land into a 4/4 creature, which can trigger and draw a card. So I don't think this card's like busted or anything, but if you're playing some sort of like Gruul Dinosaur deck or Gruul Stompy deck, which is a bunch of big creatures, I would actually consider playing this in one of my card draw slots. Plus, you get the Earthbend as a little bonus. Rounding things out today, we got a bunch more cards from the special Avatar source material sheet, showing off art from the show itself. Value-wise, the 2 big ones here. Teferi's Protection, like $50 or something at the moment. The Bloodbender's right, Bloodchief Ascension is like $20. The rest of the stuff, I don't think super high value, but hey, if you like the art, some cool options to pick up with some of your favorite Avatar characters. We also got just a bunch of Draft Chaff stuff that you can check out over at MTGPreviews.com, including a whole cycle of dual lands that probably be important for fixing in Limited, but probably not going to be good enough to see playing Constructed. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Avatar spoilers for today. So what do you think of these new cards? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Avatar spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, everyone, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can find yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the Against the Odds, where we sawed our own creatures in half, but infinitely.